In the days just before Christmas, Buffalo, New York was hit by a deadly blizzard that dumped over 50 inches of snow on the region. On the evening of December 23rd, Jay Whithy, a 27-year-old mechanic from the town of Kenmore near Buffalo, went out into that weather in his truck to try to help a friend whose car was stuck in the snow. But Jay never reached his friend because his own truck became stuck and the snow was falling faster than he could shovel his way out of it. In the meantime, Jay noticed others on the street who had also become stranded, complete strangers, whom he invited to get into his truck to stay warm with the engine running. He called 911 for help, but no emergency crews could reach them. He went door to door on that street, explaining his plight and that of the others who were stranded. He even offered them money. No one let them in. His truck only had a quarter tank of fuel left, and by the early morning of Christmas Eve, it ran out of gas. No more heat. Now, through the night, Jay saw even more people, including 7 elderly folks who were also stranded, plus a couple of dogs. He could see there was a school about 700 feet up the road from where he was, and he suspected the power would be on inside the school and that there would be food too. So Jay made his way to the school, broke in, and led 24 people to safety. In the school cafeteria, they found food, restrooms, and warmth. By late on Christmas Day, the storm was finally moving away, so Jay found the school snowblower, went outside, and cleared the snow away from the vehicles of his stranded survivors. And before leaving the school himself, Jay left a handwritten note on the school door, and it read, "To whomever it may concern, I'm terribly sorry about breaking the school window and for breaking into the kitchen. I had to do it to save everyone and get them shelter and food and a bathroom. Merry Christmas, Jay." So now Jay Whithy is being hailed as a hero, and rightly so. By the way, his friend did find help and is okay. But when I pull back a little and consider his story, I see something more. Now, you could say he was foolish to venture out into a raging blizzard in the first place, that was way too risky, but his friend needed help, and Jay thought he was worth the risk. But in the middle of trying to help one person, his own life was endangered. He told reporters later it was the first time in his life he thought he might actually die. But by being where he was, when he was, out in that horrible weather, and by being alert to the needs of others in the same predicament, he found a way through that, a way that literally led to life. Jay's story is something of a parable, and it's well worth our attention. There's a lot more to it than a tale of heroism, although that can't be diminished. Heroes are everyday people in extraordinary circumstances who do the right thing. But what stands out for me in this story is not so much the heroism, it's the risk that was taken that made a life-saving difference. Now, storms of one kind or another are just a fact of living. When bad stuff happens, we like to find neat and tidy cause and effect reasons why. Finding answers to the inexplicable helps us make sense of things. It brings some order to chaos if we can assign blame when something goes wrong, or if we can draw a straight line between a loved one's cancer diagnosis and their exposure years before to a dangerous substance, for instance. It might make us feel, at least temporarily, like we have some control over things when we find logical explanations. There's comfort in that, but we also know that sometimes bad things happen, relationships go sour, one home is destroyed by a tornado while the house next door doesn't get a scratch. Someone you once trusted and relied on causes you pain and turmoil. We can try to find answers, but sometimes we come up short. One of our most common responses when things like that happen is to circle the wagons as a way of protecting ourselves. Makes sense. No one wants to get hurt. But as normal as that response may be, it's actually the least helpful to our well-being, to our growth, and to our happiness. Because we are creatures who've been embedded with the need to have hope. We thrive on it. Without it, we can literally die. We can hope in the first place because we have very large frontal lobes in our heads that spend a lot of time focused on the future. Now, at one extreme, when some of us imagine the future, we revisit the sorrow-filled events of our past and assume that unless we're very, very careful, those painful things are likely to happen again. So we're reluctant to venture out, emotionally or otherwise. At the other extreme, we imagine a future of unlimited possibility and joy, believing that each day to come will be better than the one before. Most of us, though, occupy an in-between space. We're informed by the past, and hopefully we regard any misfortunes as life lessons, lessons we would have much rather avoided, but we can't change. And we can have hope, but it's hope that's tempered a bit. Cautious optimism. That's where most of us live. But what about someone like Jay Withy? On that snowy night, where was he on the spectrum between without hope and being filled with hope? And wherever he was in his own mind, although it might have seemed counterintuitive to do so, what made him take such a risk by venturing out into that weather? And what about a group of people who one day dropped their fishing nets to take up a life of following an itinerant preacher? Now, the way I heard this story growing up, it was assumed that those fishermen had never before laid eyes on Jesus. They had never even heard of him. That they just dropped everything, their jobs, their livelihood, to go fish for people, as Jesus puts it. It's likely the truth is a little more complex. Matthew begins this section of his gospel telling us Jesus had moved to the town of Capernaum on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee. And probably in the streets and even in the synagogue there, Jesus began proclaiming, "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven has come near." So it's very possible Peter and the other fishermen had heard Jesus preach, or at the very least they had heard about him. They may have even known him personally. John's gospel, for one, actually says that. I know that's not the way we often envision this story, but Capernaum was a small town, so the presence of this new preacher and teacher would not have gone unnoticed. Still, it would have been just as easy for these fishermen to ignore Jesus or to shrug off his challenge to become fishers of people. They had their lives and their work to get on with. They had stability and security. Why would they want to leave all that behind and follow this guy around? And the world beyond that safe corner of the Sea of Galilee was an increasingly dangerous place. It was a time of social discontent. People were unhappy, especially the poor and working class. They struggled, paying the Jewish temple tax and all the taxes placed on them by the Romans, and working for rich absentee landowners, and witnessing the corruption and the collusion between their very own religious leaders and the representatives of the occupying Roman Empire. This passage from Matthew starts by telling us Jesus began his ministry in Galilee only after hearing that his cousin John the Baptist had been arrested. And John was arrested because he had been such a vocal critic of the people in power. John had his group of disciples, and now Jesus was forming up his own disciples, and in many respects, he was taking up John's cause, although in a different way. Jesus' approach was more subtle, less in your face, and more in your heart and mind. Just the same, it was risky business to be out in public with a group of followers and saying stuff like, "Repent, the kingdom of heaven's near." Now, that might have been good news to the common people, but to the folks in power? Any talk about a new kingdom, that was a direct challenge to their authority. So the fishermen, Peter, Andrew, James, and John, they were no dummies. Everyone knew what had happened to John the Baptist, and they knew that while what Jesus was saying was wonderful and filled with hope, it was also very dangerous. It was not merely their livelihood they were risking, it was their very lives. But they made that decision anyway to follow him. Now, why would they do that? Why would they take such a risk with so many unknowns? They had to know they were taking a gamble. But as it turned out, they had no idea what they were in for. Their journey with Jesus would take them to places they'd never been before, experiences they'd never imagined. They would befriend people who were social outcasts and religious heretics. They'd break bread with people everyone else believed were the scum of the earth. The disciples were constantly being challenged to reconfigure their long-held religious beliefs about what was right and wrong, what was faithful and unfaithful, to truly alter their perception of reality. The biggest reality of all being God's ability to turn the impossible into something possible. God's ability to make all things new. The reality that God's love has no limits, knows no boundaries, and leaves no one behind. So he's not telling this story because it's an interesting anecdote. He's explaining the very nature of being a follower of Jesus. That making that decision always means taking a risk and leaving something behind. Now, it might not be our livelihood we're leaving behind, and it might not mean we're risking our own lives, but a life of following the path of Jesus does require a decision. Really many small decisions every day that are risky because those choices change us. They move us in fresh directions. They open our minds and hearts. They bring new life and justice and hope into the world. A decision like leaving behind our need to always be right, dropping our nets that represent following the path of least resistance, especially dropping our nets of doing things the same way we've always done them while expecting completely different results. A life of faith is about deciding to walk away from the security of believing that some people are unworthy, or that because they don't look like us or agree with us or they're different from us or they're gay or they don't believe exactly what we believe, that God does not accept and love them completely. Those nets surely need to be dropped if we're ever going to be people or a church that's in any way relevant to the needs of our friends, neighbors, family members, and co-workers today who are seeking belonging and community and meaning and purpose in their lives. Now, I know it's not always easy to drop any nets that we see as absolutes and open ourselves to how God is still speaking and still making things new in the world. It can feel risky. But I believe we are called to drop those nets of safety and security and take a sacred journey into the new opportunities God is creating every day. Now, it's risky business, maybe even scary. And we never know absolutely what's in store when we venture out into that weather. Now, would those 4 fishermen have ever made the decision to follow Jesus if they had known what was in store for them? Maybe, maybe not. The point is they did not and could not know what was in store any more than you and I can be sure of knowing everything that following Jesus is going to mean for us. But as individuals and as a church, that's why we're here. No healthy church exists to provide safe and easy answers, but to do our best to follow. Not to ever presume we know it all, but to follow. Not to claim it's our way or the highway, but to follow. Not to be satisfied with the status quo, but to follow. To decide to follow, even if we don't know everything that lies ahead. Because not to decide, not to risk, that's the same thing as deciding to do nothing. But we also need to remember this. Jesus decided to take a chance on his disciples. God is always taking risks on all kinds of people, on you and me. And one thing the Bible makes perfectly clear is the journey we decide to take is never a trip we make alone. The same one who calls us to follow also gives us strength and wisdom and courage and hope when we need it most. Maybe that was the decisive factor for those fishermen who dropped their nets. Maybe they sensed that the one who was calling them was someone who could be trusted to walk with them and see them through anything. My mother-in-law, Pauline Durrett Robertson, was a poet. Many years ago, she published a poem called A Decent Life. It goes like this. I was counting my fish when I thought I heard him call to me. But of course, only a fool would lay down their nets of his trade to follow a dreamer. And so for all these years, I've been right here, counting fish. I don't know about you, but I don't want to look back on my life and say I was content to stay put and spend my precious time counting fish. The 13th century Persian poet and Sufi mystic Rumi wrote this. You were born with potential. You were born with goodness and trust. You were born with ideals and dreams. You were born with greatness. You were born with wings. You are not meant for crawling, so don't. You have wings. Learn to use them and fly. Now, flying is risky, but we're not just made for holding onto our nets. So let's drop them. Let's venture out into the risky weather and let's fly.